Regardless of whether you call it swirling, twirling, or popping your seam allowances, I'm going to show you a great technique for making a flatter quilt block. I'm going to take a 4-patch quilt block and show you what you can do to create a flatter quilt block. It's going to look nicer and it's going to make it easier for you to quilt in your finished project. Little things like this are all about taking your patchwork and quilting skills up to the next level. Follow along and learn how you too can create beautiful quilt blocks.
So in order to show you how you might be able to swirl some seam allowances, I'm going to do you an example with a 4-patch using 4 different colours, and I'm going to sew them together using different coloured threads so you can be as clear as possible as to what's going on. So I'm going to take my first 2 squares and I'm going to sew those together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, as you would do normally. I have my 1/4 inch foot on, and I have my stitch length reduced slightly, as you do with all patchwork and quilting. So I'm just going to sew down from one end to the other. No need to reverse. And you can see there I've just got a line of black stitching joining those 2 together. I'm going to press those flat, and then I'm going to, which way round did I say they were going to be? Let's do them that way. And then I'm going to press my seam allowance towards this yellow fabric. And I'm going to allow that to cool underneath my clapper just whilst I sew these 2 together. But I'm going to sew these 2 together with a different colour thread so that you can see what's going on. So I'm just going to change that on my machine. So I'm now going to join these 2 together, right sides together, raw edges matching. So you can see I've done this with the blue stitching. And this time I'm going to press my seam allowances in the opposite direction to the row above. So I'm going to press these towards the pink. So press that flat to set the stitches, press it away. And again, I'm going to let that seam sit and set whilst I just change my thread one more time. Okay, so now we have our 2 rows, each with 2 squares. We're going to join these with right sides together. And because we've got one seam allowance going this way and the other this way, we can nest these 2 points here, which will mean hopefully we'll get a lovely sharp point in the middle. So you can just feel with your fingers that these seam allowances, because they're stacked on top of each other, sit right up against this seam here, because these seam allowances for this pair are on the other side. So it just spreads the load, and you can feel those just right up against each other here. And you can pin if you like, but I'm just going to sew. And again, we're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you have a seam on the underside like I do that's pointing in this direction, just watch that this little seam allowance here doesn't get caught on the feed dogs on the underside. Okay, so we have here our first pair that's been sewn together with black stitching, the second pair that was sewn with the blue stitching, and now I've sewn all the way along using the red. So now we have our block ready. What we want to do is we want to be able to press this so that all of these seam allowances are going in the same direction. So these would be going in an anti-clockwise direction. Yours may go clockwise, it depends on the way that you've pressed your block, but in essence, you want the seam allowances all to be going in the same way. So we want this one to be going up and we want this one to be going down. And what that will do is that will create a nice little, tiny little 4 patch in the middle here. That means that this bulk will sit nice and flat. Because if you press this with all the seam allowances going upwards, you've got a point in here where you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces of fabric all in this spot here, and that gets a little bit more bulky. And when you come to quilt on top of that and come to press, you'll find that this bit here sits more proud than everything else, which can cause you problems quilting, or just aesthetically it doesn't look as nice. So to release these stitches on the pair here that we have, the first pair where I stitched in black, we're just releasing the stitches, if I open it out here, between the blue and the yellow. So just slide these out. Because you've done a slightly shorter stitch length, you're more secure. And what I tend to do is I tend to just loosen the stitches rather than actually cut them with my stitch ripper. I'll just loosen them. So the thread's still there, but it's just loosened it out enough so that you can push this yellow piece here in this direction and the blue will come in this direction. I'm going to slide it around here. Now we've got this pair here where I stitched in blue, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to open this out. Ooh. The seam allowance here, just between the purple and the pink, and I'm going to just release those stitches. So what that will mean is that the pink seam allowance can go up in this direction and the purple will be able to come down this way. And can you see here how a tiny little 4 patch is being formed? At this point, this is where you can go in and press with your iron and make this nice and flat. Push this seam allowance this way and this one this way, and everything will look super. So now we have the reverse of our block. We've got the 2 different rows. The first one that we did with the black stitching, that seam was already pressed in this direction, and the other unit, the seam was already pressed going the other way. So they're already nice and flat. You can then take your iron and go in and press this little 4 patch with the very tip of your iron. This is where a small sewing iron or travel iron is really useful. So now that we've got one seam going this way and one this way, you want the other 2 to follow in this same direction. Mine are going anti-clockwise, but depending on how you've pressed these, your seams might be going in a clockwise. But either way, just make sure that they're all flowing around nicely. So we've got the 4 patch, mini 4 patch in the middle pressed. Then going to take the iron and press this one in this direction. You might want to just tug this little bit of fabric in the top corner just to make sure that no pleats get formed on the underside. I'm going to rotate it round and then press the other one. And once I'm happy that that's all sitting nice and flat, I can then turn it over and give it one final press. Allow that to cool with a seam clapper, or just allow it to cool. So there you have it, a 4 patch quilt block that's been pressed nice and flat with the centre seam allowance here that's been swirled or popped or twirled, however you want to call it, to spread that seam allowance, the bulk of those seam allowances around the block, and that makes it nice and flat. Looks visually a lot better than one part being bulky, and of course makes it easier to quilt over the top of at the next stage when you're putting it into your final project.
Make sure you check out my ultimate guide to 4 patch quilt blocks. You will learn all about the structure of the 4 patch quilt block and how you can elevate that and move on from the basic skills. I have for you several different construction techniques and some layout suggestions as to how you can use 4 patch quilt blocks really effectively. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with all of my video tutorials. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you next time.